There's a version of American history that gets told in school, a version where hard-working settlers pushed into the wilderness, cleared the land with their own two hands, and built a booming nation out of nothing but determination and hard work. And while that story is not completely wrong, it leaves out some very uncomfortable details. Details about who actually did the clearing, whose land it was to begin with, and what happened to the people who stood between the timber industry and the enormous fortune it was chasing. By the late 1800s, the United States had built one of the most powerful industries the world had ever seen. Sawmills were turning ancient forests into lumber at a pace that seemed almost impossible, supplying a growing country that needed wood for homes, railroads, bridges, and factories. Cities were going up almost overnight, and the demand for lumber never slowed down. The men at the top of this industry became some of the richest people in American history. Their names attached to mansions, charities, and university buildings that still stand today. But behind all that wealth was a system built on two things that most history books prefer to skip past. The first was land that did not belong to the timber companies, land that had been home to native nations for thousands of years and was taken through a combination of broken promises, military force, and outright fraud. The second was labor that was pulled from men who had no real choice, whether they were formerly enslaved black men trapped in a brutal convict leasing system or poor workers buried in debt so deep they could never walk away. This is the story of how America's timber empire was actually built. And once you understand it, the lumber in every old building, every railroad tie, and every Victorian mansion looks a little different. Before we go any further, subscribe for real stories about American history that schools rarely teach. To understand what the timber boom destroyed, you first have to understand what was there before it. When European settlers arrived on the North American continent, they found a landscape that is almost impossible to picture today. Forests stretched across hundreds of millions of acres, from the hardwood forests of the East Coast to the towering pines of the Great Lakes, from the longleaf pine forests of the Deep South to the enormous Douglas firs of the Pacific Northwest. Scientists and historians believe the original forests of North America covered somewhere between 800 million and 1 billion acres. Today, less than 5% of the continent's original old-growth forests still exist. But those forests were not empty or abandoned. They were not resources just sitting there, waiting to be used. They were home to hundreds of native nations, each with their own relationship to the land, their own ways of managing it, and their own deep knowledge of how the forest worked. For thousands of years, native communities had been living inside these forests and actively shaping them through controlled burning, careful harvesting, and long-term stewardship. When Lewis and Clark described the wild and seemingly untouched wilderness of the American interior in the early 1800s, they were actually looking at land that human beings had been managing for thousands of years. The Anishinaabe people of the Great Lakes had built complex relationships with the white pine forests that would later become the center of the American lumber industry. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also called the Iroquois, had managed forests across what is now New York and Pennsylvania for centuries. The Muskogee, the Choctaw, and the Creek Nations had been stewards of the longleaf pine forests of the American South for generations. These forests were not just useful to these communities, they were central to their spiritual lives, their economies, their food systems, and who they were as peoples. When the American sawmill industry began its rapid expansion after the Civil War, it did not enter an empty wilderness. It entered a landscape that was already occupied, already cared for, and already deeply important to the people who lived there. The industry's success required not just the cutting of trees, but the removal of the people who called those forests home. The first sawmills in North America go back to the early 1600s, with the first recorded water-powered sawmill in the colonies built in Maine around 1634. These early mills were small and local, cutting lumber for nearby settlements. But as the country grew, and especially as railroads began connecting far-off regions to big markets in the mid-1800s, the scale of the lumber industry changed completely. What had been a collection of small local operations began turning into a national industrial machine, and the men running it stopped thinking in terms of local forests and started thinking in terms of continent-wide timber supplies. That shift in thinking is what made the Gilded Age timber boom so destructive. It was not just that more trees were being cut, it was that the industry had developed an appetite for timber that no single region could feed for long. And when the forests of one region ran out, the industry simply moved on to the next one, leaving behind stripped landscapes, scattered communities, and damage that would take generations to fully understand. The story of how timber companies got access to Native American forest land is one of the most troubling chapters in American history. It involved federal government policy, corporate pressure, fraudulent deals, military removal, and a set of laws that were built specifically to move indigenous land into private hands as fast as possible. By the time the big timber boom started in the 1870s and 1880s, the federal government had already been pushing native nations off their traditional lands for decades. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 had forced the relocation of dozens of eastern tribes to land west of the Mississippi River, clearing the way for white settlement and, eventually, for the commercial use of forests in the southeast. But even after removal, many native nations still held significant land through treaty agreements, and that land increasingly overlapped with what the timber industry wanted. The General Allotment Act of 1887, also called the Dawes Act, was probably the single most damaging piece of legislation for native land ownership during the timber era. The official reason given for the Dawes Act was that breaking up communally held tribal lands into individual plots would help Native Americans fit into American society by giving them private property. But what the law actually did was open up enormous amounts of native land for outside buyers to purchase. Under the Dawes Act, each Native American family was given an individual plot, usually 160 acres, and whatever land was left over after those plots were handed out was labeled surplus land and opened up for non-Indian buyers. In heavily forested regions, that so-called surplus land was often some of the most valuable timber territory in the country. The numbers are staggering. Before the Dawes Act, Native nations together held about 138 million acres of land. By the time the allotment period ended in 1934, that number had fallen to about 48 million acres. 90 million acres of native land moved into non-Indian ownership in less than 50 years, and a large share of that land was either forested or located in regions where timber was the most valuable resource available. In the Pacific Northwest, the situation was especially harsh. The tribes of Western Washington and Oregon had signed treaties in the 1850s that promised them protected homelands, fishing rights, and the ability to keep living in their traditional ways. What those treaties actually delivered was something much more limited. The federal government consistently read treaty boundaries in ways that benefited white settlers, and as the Pacific Northwest timber industry expanded in the 1880s and 1890s, the pressure on tribal lands became almost impossible to resist. The Siklallam, the Kinaw, the Makah, and dozens of other Pacific Northwest tribes found themselves watching their traditional forests being logged by companies that had purchased or leased the land from the federal government, often without any real discussion with the tribes that still held treaty rights there. The Quinault Nation, whose reservation on the Olympic Peninsula held some of the most remarkable temperate rainforest in North America, spent decades fighting both the federal government and private timber companies over logging rights inside their reservation. In the Great Lakes region, the situation for the Anishinaabe was similarly devastating. The white pine forests of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota were the heart of the American lumber industry for much of the 1870s and 1880s, and the rapid destruction of those forests happened almost entirely on or near land that native nations had lived on for thousands of years. The Treaty of 1837, the Treaty of 1842, and the Treaty of 1854 had guaranteed hunting and fishing rights for Ojibwe bands across large parts of the upper Midwest, but those rights offered little defense against logging operations that were stripping the land bare at industrial speed. Fraud was also a standard tool for getting access to native timber. Federal Indian agents, whose job was supposed to be protecting tribal resources and native interests, were regularly bribed by timber companies to allow illegal or underpriced logging on tribal land. Timber that should have generated real money for native communities was cut and sold for a small fraction of its value, with the gap going straight into the pockets of corrupt officials and company owners. One of the clearest examples of this kind of corruption happened in the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. The 5 civilized tribes, including the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, had been relocated to this region after the Indian Removal Act. These nations had built working societies in their new territories, and the forests there were among their most important economic resources. But as timber demand grew and Oklahoma statehood got closer in the early 1900s, federal pressure on these tribes to accept allotment of their communally held lands became enormous. The Curtis Act of 1898 dissolved tribal governments and forced allotment of tribal lands, opening the door for timber companies to take control of resources that had previously been managed by the tribes themselves. What happened to native forest communities during the timber boom was not just an unfortunate side effect of economic progress. It was the result of deliberate choices made at the highest levels of the American government. Choices that put corporate profits and white settlement above treaty agreements and indigenous rights. And the biggest winners from those choices were the timber barons who built their fortunes on land they never had any right to take. If this story is opening your eyes so far, make sure you're subscribed for more hidden chapters of history like this. When you picture a 19th century sawmill worker, you might think of a tough frontiersman, maybe a recent immigrant with calloused hands and a strong back, earning an honest if modest wage for genuinely hard and dangerous work. And in some cases, that picture is accurate, but across large parts of the American South, and in ways that reached into other regions too, the labor that powered the sawmill industry was not free labor at all. It was pulled from men who were given no real options, and the men caught in those systems paid a price far greater than any paycheck could capture. The most important of these systems, and the one most directly tied to the sawmill industry, in the post-Civil War South, was convict leasing. To understand convict leasing, you have to understand the economic crisis the South faced right after the Civil War. The freeing of 4 million enslaved people had completely disrupted the South's plantation economy, which had been built entirely on unpaid forced labor. Southern planters and business owners needed a new source of cheap workers, and they found one almost immediately by exploiting the criminal justice system. The Black Codes, passed by Southern states right after the Civil War, turned a wide range of everyday behaviors into crimes, and those crimes were aimed specifically at black men. Vagrancy laws made it illegal to be unemployed, which in the chaos of the post-war period was the situation that most formerly enslaved people found themselves in. Other laws made it a crime to break a labor contract, meaning a black worker could be arrested and imprisoned simply for leaving a job. The result was that thousands of blacks. Men were arrested, tried in courts that offered almost no real legal protection, and sentenced to forced labor on behalf of the state. Convict leasing was the system that moved that labor into private hands. Instead of building state prisons, Southern states leased their inmates to private businesses, which paid the state a fee in exchange for the right to use convict workers however they chose. The state got money without spending it on prisons, and the companies got labor that cost almost nothing. The convicts themselves received no wages, had no rights, and were completely under the control of whoever had leased them. For the sawmill industry, convict leasing was practically a perfect solution to the problem of labor costs in remote, difficult locations. Sawmills in the Deep South, especially those in the pine forests and swamps of places like Georgia, Mississippi, and Florida, were far from cities and required workers to live on-site in conditions that free workers would often refuse. Convict workers had no choice but to accept those conditions, and the companies leasing them had no legal obligation to make the workplace safe or humane. The conditions inside these convict labor camps were, by almost every account from the time, terrible. Men were kept in wooden stockades or barracks surrounded by armed guards. They worked from sunrise to sunset 6 or 7 days a week in one of the most physically dangerous work environments that existed. Sawmill work meant constant contact with sharp blades, heavy logs, steam-powered machinery, and harsh weather. Injuries were frequent, and medical care was nearly non-existent. Men who were hurt badly enough to stop working were sometimes simply left behind. Death rates inside these camps were shockingly high. Studies of convict labor in Alabama found that the yearly death rate among leased convicts sometimes exceeded 40%, meaning nearly half of all men sent into the system could expect to die there. In Florida, where lumber camps and turpentine operations were the main users of convict labor, the numbers were just as grim. The men who died in these camps were buried in unmarked graves on the same land where they had worked. Their families often never told what had happened. It is not possible to talk about the convict leasing system without being clear about what it actually was. Scholars who have studied this era, including Douglas Blackman, whose book Slavery by Another Name went through the system in careful detail, have made a strong case that convict leasing was simply re-enslavement. It was a system built specifically to work around the 13th Amendment's ban on slavery by using the criminal justice system as cover. The men caught in it had usually done nothing that deserved imprisonment. They had been arrested under laws designed to catch them, tried in courts designed to convict them, and handed to companies that treated them like property. The lumber industry was one of the main beneficiaries of this system. Operations across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas depended heavily on leased convict labor all through the late 1800s and early 1900s. Companies like the Hilton and Dodge Lumber Company and dozens of others used convict labor to fell timber, run sawmills, and process wood products in conditions no free worker would have tolerated. The profits from that labor moved upward to investors and executives, many of them living in northern cities, who had no direct knowledge of or interest in where those profits were actually coming from. But convict leasing was not the only way the sawmill industry exploited its workers. Debt peonage, a system where workers got trapped in debts they could never repay, was common across logging camps in the South and beyond. The company store was the main tool of debt peonage. workers in remote camps were often paid entirely in scrip, a kind of fake currency that could only be spent at the company's own store. Since workers had no way to shop anywhere else, they were completely dependent on the company store for food, clothes, tools, and everything else they needed, and the company store always charged prices far higher than what those goods would cost in the outside world. The outcome was that workers stayed permanently in debt to the company, unable to quit without settling debts that could never actually be paid off. Under laws that made debt evasion a crime, workers who tried to leave without clearing what they owed could be arrested and returned to the camp, sometimes in chains. This was not an occasional threat. It was a routine tool used to keep men from leaving logging operations across the country. For black workers in the South, debt peonage and convict leasing often worked together, with men cycling back and forth between the two systems, depending on their status at any given moment. A free black man who fell into debt at a company store might be arrested, under a vagrancy law, and sent to a convict labor camp, then released back into another cycle of debt peonage with a different company. The two systems locked together in ways that made escape nearly impossible. Not everyone accepted these conditions without a fight. All across the sawmill regions of America, workers organized, resisted, and sometimes openly rebelled against a system designed to crush them. And while those efforts were often met with brutal force, they represent one of the most overlooked chapters of American labor history. In the piney woods of Louisiana and Texas, black and white timber workers made a remarkable and unlikely alliance in the early 1900s through the Brotherhood of Timber Workers. Founded around 1910, the Brotherhood organized workers across racial lines at a time when that was almost unheard of in the South. At its peak, the organization had somewhere between 20 and 30,000 members, spread across hundreds of sawmill camps and logging operations. These were workers who lived under company control, were paid in scrip, shopped at company stores, and could be fired and blacklisted at any moment. And yet they organized anyway. The timber companies responded the way powerful industries often do. They fired workers who joined the union, evicted families from company housing, cut off credit at company stores, and brought in armed guards to break up organizing activity. In 1912, things came to a head in Grabo, Louisiana, when a confrontation between Brotherhood members and company gunmen left several people dead on both sides. The incident, known as the Grabo Massacre, led to the arrest and trial of more than 50 Union members, though most were ultimately acquitted. The Brotherhood itself did not survive long after that, dismantled through a combination of corporate pressure, legal prosecution, and racial divisions that the companies worked hard to deepen. Even within the convict labor camps, resistance was not unknown. Men ran when they got the chance, despite the violent consequences of being caught. Some organized work slowdowns, finding small ways to resist without triggering immediate punishment. A few managed to get word out about conditions in the camps, contributing to a growing public awareness that eventually helped fuel the political movement to end convict leasing altogether. In the Pacific Northwest, the industrial workers of the world, commonly called the Wobblies, became a major presence in the logging industry in the years leading up to World War I. The Wobblies believed in organizing all workers, regardless of race, skill level, or immigration status, which put them directly at odds with the major timber companies and with more conservative labor unions that excluded certain groups. They pushed for the 8-hour workday, safer working conditions, and decent wages in logging camps where men routinely worked 10 and 12-hour shifts in environments where a moment of inattention could mean losing a limb or a life. The response from timber companies and state governments was severe. Wobblies were arrested, beaten, and in some cases killed. During the years of World War I, federal authorities cracked down hard on the organization, using wartime sedition laws as justification. But before they were suppressed, the Wobblies had managed to win some genuine improvements in conditions for logging workers in the Northwest, and their campaigns helped lay the groundwork for the broader labor protections that would eventually come through New Deal legislation in the 1930s. The workers who fought back in the sawmill era did not win everything they were fighting for. Most of them did not win much at all, at least not immediately. But their resistance mattered because it created a record that this system was not accepted, it was endured. And it proved that even workers with almost no legal protection, no political power, and no public voice were willing to risk everything to push back against conditions designed to keep them trapped. That part of the story deserves to be told alongside the story of the men who profited from the industry's growth. To fully understand the dark side of America's sawmill industry, it helps to look at the men who built it and understand exactly how their personal wealth was connected to the land theft and labor exploitation described in the earlier chapters. The timber barons of the Gilded Age were among the richest men of their time, and their names are woven into American history in ways most people do not think twice about. Frederick Weyerhaeuser is probably the most well-known. Born in Germany and arriving in the United States as a young man, Weyerhaeuser began buying timberland in the upper Midwest in the 1860s and eventually built a timber empire that spread across millions of acres in the Pacific Northwest, the Rocky Mountains, and the South. In 1900, he bought 900,000 acres of Washington state timberland from the Northern Pacific Railroad for $6 an acre, one of the largest private land purchases in American history. That land, much of it part of the railroad's federal land grant, sat right on or next to territory that had been home to native nations for thousands of years. Weyerhaeuser was not a noticeably cruel man in his personal life, and he was not directly tied to the convict leasing system, but his company operated inside the same economic world that the lumber industry had built, benefiting from land values pushed down by federal Indian policy and from a labor market shaped by decades of exploitation. The fortune he built became one of the most lasting in American business, and the company with his name is still operating today. In the South, timber operators were often more directly connected to the worst parts of the industry. Logging companies that openly relied on convict labor were common in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida, and their owners used political connections to keep the supply of convict workers steady. The relationship between Southern timber companies and state governments was often a straightforward trade. The state provided labor through the criminal justice system, and the companies provided money and political support in return. The wealth generated by the timber industry bought respectability, the way it always does. Timber barons gave money to universities, funded libraries, built churches, and ran for office. Their names were put on charitable institutions that still exist today, and their public images were carefully managed to tell the story of enterprise and hard work while hiding the story of dispossession and forced labor that actually created their fortunes. The federal government played an active role in making all of this possible. The Homestead Act and the railroad land grants of the post-Civil War years moved enormous amounts of federal land into private hands, often at prices that had nothing to do with the land's actual timber value. The Northern Pacific Railroad's land grant covered over 40 million acres, much of it in the heavily forested Pacific Northwest, and much of it overlapping with native treaty territories. When timber companies bought that land from the railroad, they were buying access to forests that had been removed from native control through the tools of federal land policy. And there was almost nothing in place to stop any of it. The Gilded Age had no federal environmental rules, no real labor protections for workers in remote locations, and no enforcement system for treaty rights. The men running the timber industry operated in a world with almost no limits except their own judgment and what was logistically possible. Most of the time, those limits turned out to be very few. The aftermath of the Gilded Age timber boom left behind a set of consequences that would take generations to understand, and some that are still being dealt with today. The environmental damage was hard to miss even at the time. The Great Lakes states, which had been the center of the American lumber industry through most of the 1870s and 1880s, were nearly completely logged out by the 1890s. Where ancient white pine forests had once spread across millions of acres in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, there were now miles of cut-over land covered in the branches and debris left by sawmill operations. That debris was so flammable it turned ordinary fires into disasters. The Peshtigo Fire of 1871, which killed somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 people in Wisconsin, remains the deadliest wildfire in American history, and it was directly tied to the logging debris left behind in the region. The destruction of the Great Lakes forests also damaged water systems, wildlife populations, and the native communities still living in the region. The Anishinaabe people, whose treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather in ceded lands were supposed to be protected, matter who owned the property, found those rights increasingly hard to use in a landscape stripped of the ecosystems they depended on. Wild rice, a food of enormous cultural and nutritional importance to many Great Lakes tribes, needs clear, slow-moving water and specific conditions that logging operations wiped out in many places. When the Great Lakes forests were gone, the industry moved south into the longleaf pine forests of the Deep South, then west into the Pacific Northwest. Each move brought the same pattern of fast extraction, environmental damage, and disruption of the communities that had depended on those forest ecosystems. The longleaf pine forest, which had once covered about 90 million acres across the southeastern United States and was one of the most biologically rich ecosystems in North America, was reduced to less than 3% of its original size by the mid-20th century, mostly because of industrial logging that began during the Gilded Age. For the Communities hit hardest by the timber boom. The consequences were deep and lasting. Native nations pushed off their forest lands found themselves on reservations that were often economically isolated, their traditional resources gone, and their treaty rights only partially honored. The wealth pulled out of their ancestral lands went to timber companies, railroad corporations, and the federal government, with almost none of it going back to the communities that had paid the biggest price. The black men and their families caught in the convict leasing system paid a cost that cannot really be measured. The men who died in convict labor camps attached to sawmills and logging operations across the South left behind families who lost not just a husband or father, but also the economic future that those men would have helped build. The generational wealth that those communities were prevented from accumulating during the convict leasing era is part of the larger story of economic inequality that still shapes the United States today. The convict leasing system was not fully ended everywhere until well into the 20th century. Alabama did not officially abolish it until 1928, though practices that looked a lot like it continued even longer in different forms. Florida kept chain gang labor until the 1950s. The men who went through these systems, and their descendants, received no payment, no acknowledgement from the companies that had profited from their labor, and no real response from the governments that had made the system possible. In recent decades, historians and advocacy groups have worked to document and face this history more honestly. Scholars, including Douglas Blackman, Edward Baptist, and Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, have written detailed accounts of how these systems worked and who they affected, pulling from plantation records, court documents, company account books, and the stories of descendants. Archaeological work at the sites of former convict labor camps has turned up human remains and physical evidence that confirms what historical records described, giving real weight to a history that some had hoped would stay buried. Native nations have also kept fighting for recognition of their treaty rights and for the return of their ancestral lands. The Anishinaabe people's fight to enforce their treaty rights in the Great Lakes region led to the Voight decision of 1983, where a federal court confirmed that treaty rights from the 1800s were still legally valid. Similar fights have been won in the Pacific Northwest, where tribes including the Acama, the Tulalip, and the Puyallup have used treaty law to protect fishing rights and, in some cases, to gain a real say in how forest resources in their traditional territories are managed. These wins matter, but they cannot fully undo the damage done during the timber boom era. Old-growth forests take centuries to develop through processes that cannot be replicated in any human lifetime. The communities that were scattered, the cultures that were disrupted, and the wealth that was taken without consent or fair pay cannot simply be handed back. What remains is the ongoing work of honesty, accountability, and wherever it is possible, repair. It would be easy to look at all of this and say it is ancient history, that these events happened in a different time with different rules, and that the people involved are long gone. But that framing misses something important about how history actually works and about how the results of past choices continue to shape everyday life. The timber fortunes built during the Gilded Age are still present in the American economy through corporate legacies, institutional endowments, and family wealth whose origins have rarely been closely examined. The Weyerhaeuser Company is still one of the largest private timberland owners in the country. The wealth built on land transferred through policies that stripped native nations of millions of acres and on. Labor taken through force and coercion did not disappear when those practices ended. It was invested, compounded, and passed down in ways that continue to shape who has money and who does not in America today. The land itself tells part of the story. The longleaf pine ecosystem is being slowly restored through conservation efforts, but no realistic timeline gets it back to anything close to what once existed. The watersheds damaged by uncontrolled 19th century logging still show the effects in reduced water quality, changed stream patterns, and fewer fish than there used to be. The native nations, whose lands were taken and whose rights were broken, are still in legal and political battles today. The Quinault Nation is still working to manage and restore temperate rainforest land that was logged more than a century ago. The Anishinaabe are still defending their treaty rights against challenges from state governments and commercial interests. The descendants of the five civilized. Tribes are still living with the results of policies that stripped their ancestors of 90 million acres of land. And the descendants of the men who were forced into convict labor and debt peonage are still living in communities whose economic foundations were weakened by generations of stolen labor. The wealth those men helped create, the lumber that built railroad stations, factory towns, and the grand houses of the Gilded Age, was never shared with them or their families. The disadvantage that piled up from that exclusion is part of the backdrop for conversations about economic inequality and racial justice that are happening right now. Understanding this history does not mean blaming every person who ever worked in the lumber business or lived in a house built from Gilded Age timber. Most people who participated in this economy did so without full knowledge of the systems behind it, or without any power to change those systems even if they had understood them. But understanding this history does mean refusing to accept a story of American economic growth that presents the prosperity of the Gilded Age as purely the result of hard work and good ideas, while leaving out the people whose land and labor made that prosperity possible. The forests of North America, the ancient trees that stood for centuries before the first sawmill blade touched them, were not simply raw material waiting to be processed. They were living ecosystems, sacred places, and the foundation of indigenous economies and cultures that had lasted for thousands of years. The men who were forced to cut those trees, who worked in convict camps and debt traps with no real way out, were not just numbers in an economic ledger. They were human beings with families, communities, and futures that were taken from them by a system built to extract as much as possible while giving back as little as it could. That is the dark truth about America's first sawmills. Not that they were built, but how they were built, and at whose expense, and whose voices were kept out of the story America chose to tell about itself. The next time you walk through an old building, a historic downtown, or a national park full of second-growth forest, take a moment to think about what came before. Think about the forest that stood there before the sawmill showed up, and the people who called that forest home. Think about the hands, often unpaid and often unfree, that cut the lumber and stacked the boards and kept the blades spinning day after day in conditions most of us will never experience. History is not just a collection of old facts. It is an explanation for the present, a map showing how we got to where we are and why things look the way they look. The history of America's timber industry is part of that map, and it is a part that gets left off far too often. If this history is new to you, consider reading some of the scholars who have spent their careers documenting it. Douglas, Blackman's Slavery, by Another Name, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous People's History of the United States, and Edward Baptist's The Half Has Never Been Told are all strong starting points for anyone who wants to go deeper into the systems this documentary has described. The full story of America's sawmills has never been completely told. But now you know a little more of it. For more real stories about the forces that built modern America, subscribe to the channel.